Hey everyone, Andrew here from the It's Andy G show. Today I have with me Donny Budinsky from Standing for Truth Ministries. Buddy, you have 30,000 subscribers. I have 50, so I do thank you very much for your time and joining me today.
Andy G, it's great to be here on your podcast. I appreciate what you do, and I know how busy you are in life, so I appreciate you inviting me on, brother. I think we're going to have a good, solid program tonight, showing you and your audience exactly why it's a great time to be a biblical creationist.
Amen. So, just quickly, Donny, growing up, I come from a Catholic Greek Orthodox background. But I kind of didn't really take much note to it. So what happened was when I was in year 11, around 17 years old, some random Baptist guy gave a DVD of was it a DVD or a VHS? I think it was a DVD. This would have been 2004 of Ken Hovind, and this is how God's providence works. I was actually doing my evolution work in a Catholic school, and then my dad put the disc in, and in the background I hear this guy talking smack about evolution. So it was literally, I think it was PNGR or some propaganda, and I was fully like just listening to it and then listening to it and listening to it. I downloaded all the sermon audios, and about 30th time in hearing the gospel, I got saved.
Amen.
So I'm one of those low IQ, takes me a while, takes it over and over and over and over before it sinks into my big fat skull. But better late than never, and God was patient. And that's
Hey, praise
so
the
I'm
Lord.
very amen. And so Donny, I'm very passionate. I don't keep up to date like 2004, 5, 6, 7. I was obsessed with like just creation. And so I have deviated a little bit, and that's why I love seeing people like yourself, because you're going to keep me updated. What are the sort of latest arguments? Because I'm still stuck in like the Ken Hovind sort of debate era where it was basically the same evidence, quote unquote, for evolution, the fossils,
Yeah.
the bones, the like all that traditional stuff. I don't know. You talked about in some of your videos about androgynous retroviruses. So, mate, you're going to have to break this all down for a very low IQ, layman terms. So, Donny, you want to talk about yourself and some of the more popular sort of evidences that they use for evolution versus creation?
That's a great question and great testimony, brother, because your testimony is very similar to mine, where I grew up largely culturally a Catholic. I say culturally because, as you probably know, we went to Mass maybe once a month, usually with school because we were forced to do so. And, you go to Mass for Christmas and Easter. But in high school, in religion class, they would teach more or less what's called theistic evolutionism. And so I'd have questions about the stories in the Bible that seem like real historical events when you read them. Adam and Eve, the story of Noah and the global flood, Moses and the Exodus. And when I would ask my Catholic teacher questions regarding those topics, the answers always had something to do with, well, those are allegorical or those are symbolic. They're not meant to be taken literal. And in many ways, that discouraged me. And after that, I got into, I would say, over the years, especially in college, Andy, I got into some pretty wild ideas regarding things like ancient alien theory, and while maybe God directed the evolutionary process. And so I was never an atheist, but agnostic towards certain aspects of the Bible, where I was like, well, possibly ancient alien theory is true, that aliens seeded the planet, or maybe they intervened within the evolutionary process of man. And I've still got, tucked away somewhere, I've still got copies of those those books with wild ideas. And so eventually I was confronted with the truth through Kent Hovind's DVDs and just a number of debates, with Christians versus atheists like John Lennox and William Lane Craig and Frank Turek. But eventually, when I saw Kent Hovind's classic debates back in the day in the universities, he had a 3-on-1 classic debate. I went through
That
them
were the
all.
best.
Yeah, I mean,
That were the best. They were great. That
oh,
was a
amazing.
classic Hover, man.
Right. And one of the clips from the 3-on-1 debate went viral, millions of views, his answer to, where
Yeah.
did God come from? And so it was through those debates and his seminars that turned me into a young earth creationist. Whereas before, definitely in the world of Christianity, just seeing how atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris were really getting demolished in debates by people like William Lane Craig, John Lennox, who were not young earth creationists, but that was kind of the window or the gateway into eventually young earth creation and then getting saved, hearing the gospel, believing in salvation by faith alone in Christ alone.
Amen.
And so ever since then, about 8 years or so, I've been doing this, and every day's an adventure, brother. I love it. And so there's a lot of information on the topic for sure. And I'm happy to get into it, Andy.
Donnie, I remember we didn't have the internet growing up, so I remember when I would go to college to learn how to build websites. We would download all of the Ken Hovind. Like I would spend it would be about 7-8 hours at college just downloading from Sermon Audio all the MP3 files of all the debates. It wasn't even it wasn't even video. It's just audio. And I would listen to them on repeat. They were absolutely fantastic. The 3 verse 1. I remember thinking, man, I know I've got low IQ, but if they can do a debate, I'm pretty sure I could do a debate.
Right.
So, I mean, that was a beatdown like I've never seen one before.
Yeah, I had no idea who Ken Hovind was, and my brother, he got saved before I did, and he recommended Ken Hovind's debates and seminars. And so after watching one, I was immediately hooked. I ended up watching, I binged, as they say, binging a Netflix series or Amazon Prime. I just binged all of his debates, all of his seminars. And again, I didn't know much about young earth creation. I knew Christianity was true at that time for sure, seeing atheism and naturalism get destroyed and exposed, and seeing all of those classic debates in the universities with Ken Hovind versus these university professors. They didn't stand a chance. I watched it objectively and I was like, okay. And this was kind of my introduction into young earth creation and eventually hearing the gospel, getting saved. And yeah, they've come up with several new arguments, Andy G, but they're just as bad as the ones back then. And they still look to arguments, which we can get into, like homology and the fossil record and radiometric dating. And so we'll show here, Andy, why none of those work, brother.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Donnie. It's remarkable that you and I have very similar paths, like with the John Lennox, Frank Turek, and we've got a very similar, almost identical path.
Mm-hmm.
The ancient aliens, maybe that's kind of where we're a little bit different, but I definitely believed in some other oddball things to more than make up for it. And even my Catholic teachers, when I would ask them about creation, because I would watch the Ken Hovind thing, I didn't get the allegorical excuse. I got I don't mix my faith and my science.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's a devastatingly poor answer. And I don't think you're very good at either, teacher. But so that was kind of, it's remarkable. So let's get into what is like, I remember the fossil record, obviously radiometric dating. Just quickly though, what is your view on, let's say, apparent age, or because I've heard the other perspective where it's not old, but it looks old. And the Stephen Anderson Ken Hovind debate was pretty interesting. That was very interesting because I was thinking I'm kind of in the middle. I think potentially I could be wrong, but potentially there's a lot more that I feel like could be apparent age that the full sort of Ken Hovind camp may not give credit for, and there is maybe not so much apparent age as, let's say, they're going to Stephen Anderson camp. I kind of somewhere in the middle. Where do you kind of find outside, let's say, Adam, or how long it takes to get light to the Earth, and obviously I've heard all the arguments about that. Stretching
Yep.
of the heavens. So, what do you fit with that? Where do you kind of sit with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think we need to go the route of an apparent age model. I would say the Earth and, of course, Adam and Eve and the original kinds were created functionally mature, I think is the better way to put it. Because to say everything looks old would also be to ignore the several lines of evidence that suggest that the Earth is not old and that it's young, like comets, magnetic field decay, dinosaur soft tissue, collagen in dinosaur bones. Many other points of evidence, mutation rates that we can get into, but functionally mature. And one thing I'd like to say, because that is a good question, and I know there's been a lot of controversy on that specific issue, is to say, well, the universe looks old or the Earth looks old. That's actually a fallacy called the reification fallacy, because, Andy, we can't actually see age. And we're being non-literal when we say, well, this person looks young or this person looks old, because what we do see, and Dr. Jason Lisle, PhD astrophysicist, he talks about this and makes several good points, that what we're looking at are physical traits and characteristics that we interpret as either old or young, right? You could see maybe wrinkles or graying of the hair or just certain characteristics that we look at and say, okay, that person looks older, that person looks younger, but we don't actually see age itself. In our experience, we as humans, right, we see babies born, we see them grow up, and we see humans get old. And so we have that experience in our lives. But when it comes to the Earth and the universe, this isn't Marvel Comics or DC Comics where we've got the multiverse. And so we got Earth 2, Earth 3, Earth 4, Universe 2, Universe 3, Universe 4. No, we've only got one Earth. We've only got one universe. So in the same way that somebody could say, well, the universe looks old, I could say it looks young. Okay? Because we don't have other universes and Earths to compare this one to. And that's why this is a fallacy. That is why saying the Earth and the universe look old is fallacious, as I could equally say that the universe looks young. When Adam was born, he wasn't through creation. He was specially created. Adam from the dirt, right? And Eve from his rib. They weren't created special as a baby or an embryo. They were functionally mature. And so they would have had pieces of evidence. If a scientist were to examine Adam and Eve, let's say an hour after creation, Adam, Andy, so if they're looking at Adam, they're going to see a mixture, right? They're going to see that he is tall. He has a build of maybe a 20 or 30-year-old. But at the same time, if they were to do a DNA test or they were to check his cholesterol levels and they were to do just a general blood count, a blood test, they're going to find pieces of evidence that make it look like he's young, right? So you're going to have a mixture there. He's not going to have spots on his body that suggest that he's old. And so I would argue, okay, in the same way that Adam, if he were examined by a medical examiner, you're going to find a mix. Oh, he's tall, 6 foot something. He weighs this much. So he must be at least 30 years old, 32. Oh, wait a minute. His DNA test or his blood count or his cholesterol levels suggest that he's really young. And so we have a mix. And I would argue that's exactly what we see in the universe, is we see a mix where maybe rocks through radiometric dating look old, okay, which they're not. We can get into that. But then other pieces of evidence like dinosaur soft tissue or C14 found in spots where they shouldn't, diamonds, coal, oil, suggest that the Earth and human beings are young. So it's a mix. Andy, does that make sense? Does that help, brother?
Yeah, man. I think, like I said, yeah, absolutely. I think I would need to look at a case by case, and that's probably not going to be for this show or for this conversation. But you can't discredit or discount lines of evidence to conclusively point to a young Earth. And And obviously the argument that, God wouldn't be deceptive, but it's not necessarily deceptive. But yeah, no, mate, you you raise very valid points. What about sort of um
I
with
think you
the
made a good point there, where people say, "Oh, God creates the universe functionally mature. He creates Adam
correct?
as a 30-year-old rather than a zygote." And
Yeah.
so if scientists come an hour after creation, same thing with the rocks. The original created rocks, we would expect a combination of elements. If they were to date the original created rocks, they might erroneously conclude that those rocks are billions of years old, even though they were just created. Okay. Or
Hmm.
trees with leaves are going to have chlorophyll in them. Okay. It doesn't mean that these came about through long millions of years processes. So when people say, "Oh, okay, so God creates the universe and also Adam and Eve functionally mature," then he's deceptive. Well, he's not deceptive because he told us in the Bible. He
Correct.
was clear that he
Exactly.
created in 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested. These are
Exactly.
24 ordinary days. Jesus Christ himself, right, Andy G? He says
Mhm.
that from the beginning of creation, pointing back to
Amen.
creation week, he made them male and female.
We're
Eh,
not. Yeah, exactly. The age is still the same. Yeah, but it's like when you look at sort of what about like when I used to get questions like, oh, how long it takes light to get from the universe. I know we're going into like multiple areas now. We should
Right.
follow your structure, right? Because I'm autistic, so I'm going to be
Well,
all
you're
over the
doing
shop,
good.
right? So like how long it takes. I'm just remembering all the arguments that they would say back in the day. I'm not so much more up to date. That's why you're here with like the arguments they use now. But the light to the Earth and how long it would take. But if it's a mature Earth, I kind of see that in the same way as Adam, and I would put that God creating that mature creation. So
Right.
how would you? Are you sort of like how long it takes millions or billions of light years to get light from one end of the universe to the other? Where do you sit with the stretching of the heavens Bible verses to explain that, or do you explain it more from that sort of apparent age sort of angle?
That's a good question, a very good question. And there are several hypotheses in the world of creation as to how we see starlight that's
I'm going to try to.
supposedly.
Sorry, Don. I'm going to try to play a bit of devil's advocate with you. I'm
Yeah, of
trying to
course.
be an evolutionist. Okay, I'm going to
Yeah.
let's go. I'm
Um,
going to throw you off. All right.
I love it. I love being thrown off. This is good. And so when it comes to distant starlight, I've had at least two, one cosmologist physicist, Dr. John Hartnett, and then Dr. Jason Lyle. He's a PhD astrophysicist. And I actually have a book behind me. It's called The Physics of Einstein, okay, by Dr. Jason Lyle. My favorite way to answer the distant starlight challenge. Firstly, the evolutionists, the Big Bang theorists, they have their own distant starlight challenge because it's called the horizon problem, okay? And it's because the universe is far too uniform in its temperature. But the Big Bang Theory would suggest that the universe is expanding. It's been expanding for billions of years. And so, how do you get light reaching multiple times the furthest reaches of the universe to transfer that energy? They would actually require, especially after the initial expansion, they would require light faster than the speed of light. So, I do like to point that out that the evolutionist has their own distant starlight problem. We actually don't have a distant starlight problem. My favorite way to solve it would be Dr. Jason Lyle and his model. I got a whole video of it on my channel that I'd recommend people check out. Uh, Having Dr. Jason Lyle on, and it's called the conventionality thesis, where it's perfectly consistent with the Einstein, with the physics of Einstein, where we are seeing, Andy, we are seeing starlight from the furthest reaches of the universe, from the furthest galaxy in real time. And that had to be the case because stars were created, the sun and moon were created as lights, right? And for days and for seasons, for Adam and Eve to see and for human beings to see. And so that light had to arrive instantly. But this sounds counterintuitive. But all it is a convention where we are seeing the most distant light in the most distant galaxy. We're seeing it in real time. So no
How
matter
and
where
how
you
do we
look in the
know?
universe, it's hitting our eyes instantaneously.
And how do we know how far away it is?
Right there's a good question, because technically starlight is a distance, and it's not
Not a time.
necessarily a time,
Correct.
right? And so they do have ways of measuring it, and so I'm not
Oh, so,
disputing
okay.
how far the light is and how
Mm,
far it's coming from. But
mm.
again, if you were to go with the physics of Einstein and the conventionality thesis, then basically we're seeing starlight as it is. From the furthest reaches of the universe, it's hitting our eyes instantaneously. And a
Okay.
lot of people are like, well, that's counterintuitive. But again, if you check out the book by Dr. Lyle, The Physics of Einstein, check out the video that I recommended. And he goes over how it's a convention that you choose. And it's perfectly consistent with physics and science. And so if we choose the convention that the Bible, I think in ancient times, what people are using is that when we see light, no matter where it is, we're seeing it in real time. And so there's no distant starlight problem. A lot of people say, well, okay, when the stars were created, right, and God stretched out the heavens, well, the stars would have been stretched out, and so the light would have been moving faster than the speed of light at that point,
Hmm.
and so Adam and Eve basically see the tail lights of the stars. I don't think that's as strong as the conventionality thesis, but that's one way some people have looked at it as well. They'll say that, in deep space, because of gravity, time works differently. We've seen that represented in movies like Interstellar, if you're familiar with that movie, where in different galaxies on different planets, uh, if you're further out, the way things work with time dilation, time in a distant galaxy, 7 years on a different planet would be 1 year here. And so in the distant universe, time and gravity work differently, where the speed of light could be faster. Those are all good options, but I think Jason Lyle's conventionality thesis is probably the easiest way to solve it, because again, if you study up the physics of Einstein, it is complicated, it is technical, but it does work. As in, there's no contradictions to it.
Yeah. Okay. Because I was just thinking, like, how will they measure sort of how far it is, or when you're looking from, like, can we even measure distances that is
Yeah, I
that kind of
mean, as Ken Hovind has pointed out, the further you go when you do these distances,
the angle starts getting thinner, etc.
right, exactly, it becomes a little more complicated.
Yeah.
So that's why it is important to point out that these numbers are a distance rather than a time.
Yeah.
But, and a big thing too is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the James Webb Space Telescope, but the James Webb Space Telescope, they've given us some really sophisticated images of distant galaxies. And the Big Bang model would predict, they have predicted, Andy, that what you would see is less mature galaxies, right? Because if it's early after the Big Bang, we wouldn't expect galaxies like our solar system, for example, or the galaxy we exist in. We wouldn't expect fully functioning mature galaxies. But the James Webb Space Telescope and Dr. Jason Lyle, again, a young Earth creationist, PhD astrophysicist, he made predictions before we got the images that what we would see in your distant galaxies billions of light years away, brother, would be reflection of creation, where contrary to Big Bang Theory, these galaxies and these stars would be fully formed. They'd have the elements that would contradict the Big Bang Theory. So the images come out, these sophisticated images, and it confirms creation. Where the furthest you look, we have fully functioning and mature galaxies. How can that be the case? Because shortly after the Big Bang, these galaxies and star formations, they'd be evolving over time. They shouldn't be
Mhm.
fully mature and fully functioning like we see in our own galaxy or closer
And
to
how
us.
would you measure what is fully mature galaxy mean in layman's terms?
Well, it would be like looking at our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, the way
Okay.
that the planets are aligned, the elements that you would find in them.
The
You,
order.
you would find, right,
Yeah.
order rather than chaos, a level of fine tuning. But in your distant galaxies, going closer to like the Big Bang, the origin of time, space, and matter, basically, you should find premature galaxies, not formed and functioning in the way that we see, let's say, our galaxy or galaxies closer to us. And so there's major contradictions with these findings. One of them, I've got my screen shared here, is supernova. So supernova remnants here. And I think this is a fascinating piece of evidence. One, before I get into this, would be, I'm sure you've heard of the magnetic field. So we know as to the rate at which the magnetic field of the Earth and decays. And it turns out that the magnetic field is decaying rapidly. Okay. And so we can actually measure the decay of Earth's magnetic field. And if you were to run back the magnetic field of the Earth even 60,000 years, it would have been stronger than a neutron star, which is more than enough to rip the atoms of your body apart. And so that powerfully limits the age of the Earth, because you can't go back too far in light of the decaying magnetic field before everything's destroyed and life can't be here, right? And so these are pieces of evidence where at the beginning, and I think we started it with a good question, that would suggest that the Earth and the universe are young. This is a really good one. So supernova remnants, these exploding stars, okay? On my slide here, according to astronomical observations, galaxies like our own experience about one supernova, which is a violently exploding star, every 25 years. The gas and dust remnants from such explosions, one example is the Crab Nebula, expand outward rapidly and should remain visible for over 1 million years. That's the theory, right? Yet the nearby parts of our galaxy in which we could observe such gas and dust shells contain only about 200 supernova remnants. That number is consistent with only about 7,000 years worth of supernovas. In other words, in layman's terms, if the universe really is billions of years old and our galaxy specifically is as old as they say, we should find a lot more supernova remnants. There are trillions and trillions of stars out there, Andy. Okay. And we can debate with the evolutionary community as to, when we ask them the question, show me the formation, the evolution of a single star. And they might point to, this location or something over here where it's getting a little brighter. And we can contest that. Maybe a star exploded and then now we're seeing the light from a star behind it, right? There's good explanations for those, but they're so minimal. Because if we have trillions and trillions of stars, we should have plenty of evidence where we can't even debate it of star formation. I mean, it's been said that every single person on the planet could own easily 1 trillion stars. And as Ken Hovind says, those are the ones that we know about. We don't know about the ones we don't know about. So major problems, star formation, the lack of supernovas. I mean, these stars should be exploding. And we should be finding many more remnants. And so these are just points of evidence in the universe itself, since you asked about distant starlight, that I think contradict evolution in an old Earth specifically.
And you're saying that basically, for people that are watching who don't know much about this, the evidence from an evolution's perspective is the stars basically form from from an explosion.
Yeah, and that's the funny part is they would require
something that's already created to explode to then create something else.
And those elements to basically come together, because that would offer the right kind of elements.
Well, the Bible says you get the same kind, right?
Yeah, and so I mean, isn't that funny that you would need the explosion of stars to apparently create new stars? But a major important point here is that if the universe really were billions of years old, we should find many more exploding star remnants. We should find many more supernova remnants, and we simply don't find that. The other point we talked about with the James Webb Space Telescope is what we see in the most distant galaxies should be more in line with Big Bang thinking, but it's not.
But Donny, correct me if I'm wrong, if they would explode, wouldn't you have a decline in the number of stars over billions of years? If it takes stars to blow up to create, wouldn't there be a deficit?
Right. Yeah. It's because the overall picture, in the overall
Correct.
picture of the universe itself, one of my favorite points of evidence, I got a whole slideshow on it. These are just slides on age limiters for the universe, is genetic degeneration and overall entropy in the universe, that things are winding down. We're not seeing the formation of new stars. We're seeing the explosion of stars. We're seeing things degrade, right? I mean, the second law of thermodynamics is the law of increasing entropy. The first law of thermodynamics states that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Well, you know what that means, Andy? Okay.
So,
If
well,
matter
it's
and
eternal,
energy
right?
can't be created nor destroyed,
The evolutionist has to go that it's eternal, right?
yeah, right. So the eternal state theory was what they used to say.
Yeah.
But then for what they say, cosmic microwave background radiation and evidence for expansion and redshifts and all these, they'll say that, okay, no, there was a beginning. And they'll say that the Big Bang doesn't explain the beginning, the origins. It explains everything after the origins, basically, because they admit they don't know where time, matter, and space came from. But here's the thing: that energy that resulted in the Big Bang, or big expansion, as they like to say, it can't be eternal because of the second law, which is the law of increasing entropy. Everything's winding down.
Hmm.
We're losing usable energy. So if everything's degrading, Andy, that means, and everything's winding down, well, you wind that back up to a point of what's called least increasing entropy. What would that be? That'd be a point of creation. But wait a minute. The first law says matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And therefore, what that means is matter and energy, brother, had to come into existence from an outside force, a supernatural force being God.
Hmm.
That's the only way. That's the only way to explain the origin of time, space, and matter in light of what we know about the first law and the second law.
The uncaused cause, yeah.
Amen. Yeah. The,
Right.
the uncaused first cause.
Yeah. So I remember they would explain, like, I mean, didn't you have to also explain the energy and the matter, like what exploding, how does it explode? I mean, the origin of life is a big problem already, but I think the origin of time, space, and matter is obviously a bigger, greater problem.
Oh, absolutely.
Almost, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the origin of life, all their different hypotheses, none of them work.
No.
All of them have major problems. Those that hold to RNA world hypothesis, they'll argue against someone who believes in carbohydrate first. And so each model in abiogenesis has major problems. And I was discussing this with Eric Hovind recently in a program we did. And there's what's called mutually interdependent systems, Andy, and
Yeah.
there's tons of them. One of them that I like
Symbiosis,
to point to,
or is it more symbiosis, or more you talk about something different?
well, it's in line with symbiotic relationships, but
Yeah.
it's more in the world of irreducible complexity.
Yep.
And so, for example, you have, and there's many we could go over. One that I like to go over because, firstly, it's easy to understand for the general audience, and secondly, the evolutionary community really has no answer. And again, these are called mutually interdependent systems. And so one of them is the fact that we have what's called DNA repair enzymes. So these incredibly designed DNA repair enzymes, because we, in a single cell, we have roughly 60 trillion cells, Andy, in our body.
Mm.
And in a single day, you could experience up to 1 million DNA breaks or DNA lesions in a single cell. And again, we have 60 trillion cells. Thank God we have these forward thinking mechanisms, okay, in our genome, these DNA repair enzymes that go in and fix a lot of these DNA breaks. Because if we didn't have those, we'd go extinct after a few generations. Now, they don't work perfectly. Okay, we still get mutations in what's called reproductive cells, that those are the ones that are passed on. And the mutation rate is high. It's about 100 new mutations per person per generation. The majority of them are deleterious, degrading, disease causing. And that actually puts shelf lives on genomes. That's genetic entropy. That's a topic for, you know, another point here in this discussion. But the point is, these DNA repair enzymes, they fix a lot of these DNA breaks. Okay. But the information for these DNA repair enzymes, they're encoded in the DNA. But you need them for the DNA to exist, to thrive. So the question for the evolutionists, this chicken and egg problem, is what came first? The DNA repair enzymes. But wait a minute, you need the DNA to code for the DNA repair enzymes. Or did the DNA come first? But that can't be the case, because you need the DNA repair enzymes to actually fix all of these DNA breaks. So do you see why this is a mutually interdependent system where both have to be there at the exact same time? You need the DNA repair enzymes and you need the DNA. And that brings us to Genesis. Everything was created very good. And DNA was created by God with DNA repair enzymes, ready to go to fix a lot of these DNA breaks. And so those are chicken and egg problems that really just preclude. What preclude means is makes impossible or highly unlikely for something like abiogenesis or naturalistic origins to be true.
You know, they say, like, you know, you can become like a, like it was easy to believe in God, you know, like 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. It would have been easier to be an evolutionist 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, because you didn't understand the complexity of life.
Right.
And as we learn more and more and more about something like DNA, this for me starts to no longer be a scientific problem and much more becomes a spiritual problem.
You nailed it, brother. You nailed it. There are so many pieces of evidence that we could go over. That's just one of them, where the rescue devices are weak, the responses are weak. And so it's not an evidence issue. The reason why people, when confronted with this evidence, the reason why they reject God, they reject a creator.
The conclusion is devastating. They're going to change their worldview.
Yeah, it's a hard issue. They're rejecting this evidence not because of a lack of evidence or because they have a good response. No, they're rejecting it on a philosophical basis. That's the problem. I mean, have a look at this. I'm not sure if you can see my screen, but this right here, this is fascinating. Okay, so in a nutshell, and this is my specialty, this is where I spend most of my time, is in the world of genetics and biology, and demonstrating the validity of separate ancestry. Separate ancestry just says, Andy, that God created, as per the Bible, humans special and unique from any other form of life. Okay, and so on the screen here, these are Y chromosomes. Y chromosome is uniparentally inherited DNA. It's passed down on one side, the father's side. So I'd have my Y chromosome from my dad. My two sons have it from me. Women don't have a Y chromosome, right? Man is an XY, women are XX. I know some in the liberal evolutionary camp don't understand that.
Careful, Donny. I want to keep my channel, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So we won't get into that. And so human Y chromosomes here. This is a visual of the human Y and the great ape Y chromosomes. So you'll notice here, you got the human Y, and we're comparing it to, I'll put it bigger screen.
Remember, Donny, keep it layman terms, yeah? Because I'm the low IQ, yeah, over here, yeah.
And feel free to ask any clarifying questions.
Because I know most people that are on my side watching this have no idea what you're talking about. They will understand X, Y. And that's where they're pretty much ends.
And that's why I started off. So I think we're on the same page that Y chromosomes are specifically inherited on the male side. That's why it's called paternally versus maternally. So your mitochondrial DNA, that's a DNA compartment, that's a chromosome that's outside of the nucleus and is only inherited on the mother's side. So that's called maternally. But both of those DNA compartments are called uniparentally inherited DNA compartments. Uni rather than bi, because they're only passed out on one side. And so amazingly, I'll just throw this out there. I got a whole presentation on this on my channel, and I give the talk. Adam and Eve. We've literally discovered Adam and Eve in our genetics, because guess what? That mitochondrial DNA can be traced back to a single woman not too long ago. and Y chromosome variation, if you were to look at all male Y chromosomes on the planet, mine, yours, every other man, they're nearly identical. And you can trace back Y chromosomes, and I think you know where I'm going here, to a single man just 4,500 years ago based on known mutation rates. And that man would have been Noah, because he'd be our last Y chromosomal ancestor. Of course, he'd ultimately go back to Adam. His Y chromosome would probably only be slightly different from Adam's. And so we have Adam, Noah, and Eve's DNA. I mean, we've confirmed Adam and Eve. Now, here's the problem, though, for the evolutionists. They have no good answer for this, Andy. So on the screen, if we're on the same page, Y chromosome. This is what we're focusing on here, okay? Male inherited. Every single male Y chromosome, human-wise, nearly identical. Basically the same, which makes sense. We go back to one man, Adam, just 6,000 years ago. We wouldn't expect our Y chromosomes to be that different because there's not a lot of time, like the evolutionists say there is, to build genetic diversity, okay? Now, notice this. The evolutionary community, who do they say is our closest relative, our closest cousin?
Chimpanzee.
The chimpanzee, right? So they'll say, okay, we and the chimpanzee go back to a common ancestor here, roughly 6 million years. That's these numbers here, 2 million, 6 million, 7 million, 13 million. And they believe that all these creatures here, they call humans human great apes, and they'll call the other great apes like chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, they'll call them non-human great apes, okay? That's a false assumption. You know, we're not an ape, we're not an animal. And this here shows that we're unrelated to the great apes. So here's your human Y. Now compare it to our so-called closest cousin, Andy. This is the chimpanzee Y. I like the visual because anybody can look at it and you'll notice the chimpanzee Y is half the size, brother, of the human Y. This human Y is nothing like the chimpanzee Y. What in the world? I thought we're related to chimpanzees. I thought we go back to a common ancestor. This specific DNA material here, this is called heterochromatin. That is a fancy word, but all it means is this is a type of DNA. It's densely packed. It's important for the organism, and it comprises repetitive sequences called satellite DNA. Anyways, the important point here is you don't find it in the chimpanzee. Human-specific heterochromatin. Where is this in the chimpanzee? It's not there, okay? So when you consider, Andy, overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, do you know how similar the human Y is to the chimpanzee Y? Brother, it is less than 30% the same. Less than 30. This right here is right from their own technical literature. Despite a recent divergence of these species, right, because they're assuming evolution, of course. They can't question the bigger picture, brother. In these technical papers, they got to assume evolution. Their Y chromosomes differ enormously. Just a little bit in size? No. Enormously in size and gene content. This is not a creationist saying this. This is right from their literature. I like debunking evolution right from their own technical work. Notice this. For example, the chimpanzee Y, again, this is from their own literature. The chimpanzee Y is only half the size of the human Y. So since the split, the hypothetical imaginary split, apparently the Y chromosome has changed so much that now it's only half the size. And the percentage of gene families shared by these two chromosomes that split, again, they're assuming that there was a split. But I would argue that this data suggests there wasn't a split, that humans are specially created, they're not related to chimpanzees. They say this is similar to that shared by human and chicken autosomes that split more than 310 million years ago. That's how surprised they were. As in the differences were so massive and incredible. They're like, wow, this is what we would have expected between humans and chicken autosomes, not humans and chimpanzees, our closest cousin. And they even admit here, puzzlingly, this is a puzzle to them, brother. Is it a puzzle to us? No, they're not related. Chimpanzees and humans aren't related. This isn't a puzzle. We can explain this. Separate ancestor, special creation can explain this. The human Y So you might have heard what's called a nested hierarchy. Oh, why do we have nested hierarchies in the primates? What that means basically is this. Humans share more. They're a lot more similar to a chimpanzee than they are to an orangutan or a dog or a fish. That's not evidence for evolution, okay? Look at modes of transportation. A sedan is a lot more similar to a hatchback than either are to a semi-tractor trailer or a plane or a boat. In design modes of transportation, you have a natural nested hierarchy. Pick any creature on the planet, it has to be more similar to something and less similar to something else. So it doesn't take much to look at a human, a chimpanzee, and let's say a dog. You know, what would you expect, Andy, without even knowing their genetic sequences? What do you believe is going to share more in terms of genes? Okay, a human and a chimp, or a human and a fish?
Human and a chimp.
Right, because they look more similar, right?
Sure.
Just take your kid to the zoo and say, okay, go look around the zoo, bring me back the creature that you think we look most similar to. They're probably going to come back with either a gorilla or a chimp or some kind of monkey because we look nothing like a fish. Okay, so that's a natural nested hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we do look a lot more similar to a chimp than we do to a dog or a fish or a bacteria. It's not evidence for evolution. These are hierarchies by design. Anyways, though, there are contradictions. There are inconsistencies to this so-called hierarchy. And they admit this right in this paper. Notice this. The human Y is more similar to the gorilla Y than to the chimpanzee Y, even though human and chimpanzees have a more recent common ancestor. Again, they're assuming evolution. This data would suggest there is no evolution. And so what that means in layman's terms is hierarchy-wise, this human Y right here should be more similar to the chimp Y
Than the gorilla
because we share a more recent relationship, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Rather than the gorilla. See, we share a common ancestor with the gorilla longer ago, more distantly than the chimp.
We should be closer to the chimpanzee because we're not as far back. You
got it. Exactly. But in terms of Y chromosomes, now here's another important point too.
It's not a puzzle, man. It's just the theory ain't working for him. It's nothing to do with being a puzzle, man.
Say that again. It's not a puzzle. It's that the theory ain't working for them. Can I steal that from you?
Of course you can, man.
I like that. It's not a puzzle. It's that the theory ain't working for. It's not even a good theory. The story ain't working for them. That's beautiful, brother. And so you're grasping this. And I would say this here is a piece of evidence that precludes, again, makes impossible common descent, human, because how are they going to account for these massive differences? When you account for overall size differences, gene content, and architecture, we're looking at Y chromosomes that are less than 30% the same. Y chromosomes lack what's called recombination for the most part. What recombination is it's just genetic scrambling. Every generation, your chromosomes line up. Okay, remember you get 50% from mom, 50% from dad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, those genetic variants recombine, they shuffle, and that's why your kids would look different. I mean, hypothetically, my wife and I, we could have 1 million kids if it were possible because of recombination, because of
they're not identical.
Right. They would all look different.
Yeah.
Right. They would look closer. They'd have features similar to us.
Yeah.
But every single child would look different because there's genetic scrambling, allows for diversity. God loves diversity. Anyways, in your Y chromosomes, though, there's no chromosomal counterpart. Because what are we looking at? XY for a man, for a woman, XX. So there's not a counterpart. So it's not going to shuffle with anything. And so it's more stable. Does that make sense? It's not scrambling every generation. So it's less messy. It's more stable. Therefore, you'd actually expect, as compared to what's called autosomal DNA, that's the fancy word for basically saying that's the kind of DNA that's biparentally inherited, where we get a copy from mom, copy from dad, they shuffle, you get new combinations of chromosomes, you get variation. That's awesome. That's built in from God. But with the Y chromosome, it's largely passed on intact. And that's why we can trace them back right to a single man. So the Y chromosome should actually be more stable. And yet, Andy, they're the most dissimilar.
Mm-hmm.
Is that not amazing? I'm not sure
Of
if you've
course it
seen
is.
this line of evidence, but this is right from the conventional literature.
Not in
brother.
this detail, no. So the X chromosomes, though, compared to the humans and the chimpanzee, are obviously very similar.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, right here. You'll notice the X chromosomes. It's a good question. Your X chromosomes are all very similar between chimpanzees, bonobos, humans.
Okay.
But here's the thing. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, brother.
No, you go. You got more important
I'm
things.
glad you brought that up. So there is what's called differentiating lines of evidence and agnostic lines of evidence, or non-discriminatory. I'll explain that for the audience, okay? So in the overall creation versus evolution debate, there is a lot of overlap. What I mean by that, Andy, is there's a lot of observations or pieces of evidence that both models can explain. So if I came to you, let's say hypothetically you're an evolutionist, right? Playing devil's advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And I were to say, Andy, creation's true because the sky is blue. Well, you'd say, Donny, you're crazy. Evolution can also account for why the sky is blue. If I were to say, well, creation's true because the earth is round. Okay, it's a sphere. You'd say,
Using the same lines of evidence.
Right. We can explain. There's overlap, okay? And so there's too much time wasted on pieces of evidence that's agnostic. Both sides can explain it. Whereas what you ever heard of homology? This is a big one, right? That these shared biological structures in the biological world, similar patterns in arms and
the
legs
radius
and
the
body.
ulnar and all that. Yeah.
Right, exactly. They'll line up humans with whales and bats and other mammals.
Yeah.
Okay, so they explain that as descent with modification. Homologous patterns due to shared ancestry. We've inherited these structures from past common ancestors. That's how they explain it. We as creationists, we'd say homologous patterns due to design. Human engineers take vehicles from North America, Asia, and Europe. Okay, so take a Honda Civic, a Chevy Cruze, and a Volkswagen Jetta. You're going to find many different similarities. They're going to have tires in common. The cars are going to be built a certain degree from the ground. They're going to have windshields. They might have backup cameras, right? Mirrors. They're going to have all types of things in common, homologous patterns. That doesn't prove that they inherited those from a common sedan ancestor in the Arctic. No, this is good design. This is common design. So both models can largely account for homology. Now, I would say that when you dig deep, homology is even a contradiction to evolution. Did you know that even in your similar sequences between humans and chimps, those similar sequences, there's differences? There's differences in how they're regulated. There are differences in how they're expressed, how they're turned on, how they're turned off. Like, for example, in the brain, and this should be an obvious one, similar sequences in the brain between humans and chimps, they're expressed totally different, right? And it doesn't take a genius to realize that humans are a lot more intelligent and sophisticated than chimpanzees. So anyways, that's all to say is there's a lot of pieces of evidence that we can both explain. And so this goes back to what you asked, which is a great question. Yes, there's a lot of similarity in the X chromosome. So we as creationists, we explain similarity due to common design. They'll explain similarity due to common descent. But wait a minute. I say, and tell me if this makes sense, it's the differences, Andy, that make all the difference. I'll say that again. It's the differences that make all the difference. We as creationists, we can explain all the similarities. But it's the dissimilarities, it's the massive differences that the evolutionists can't explain, but we can also explain because we don't believe all life, including whales and pine trees and human beings and strawberries are related through common ancestry. We believe in separate ancestries. So what do we expect? We expect both similarities and differences, oftentimes incredible differences. Have a look at this. This is the latest research from basically 2023, 2024. If you were to take the human Y here and go compare it to the chimpanzee Y, this is how you do it. You got chimpanzee over here, brother, human over here. How you know you're doing this right? Take your human and compare it to the human. What does that say? 100%, right? Obviously, human to human, we're the same. Take your human to the chimp. What's that number there?
Sorry, I thought it was on mute. 26%. Sorry, mate.
Yeah, no worries, brother. Not to put you on the spot. 26%. 26%. Just sit there and think about that for a little bit. Human to human, 100%. Chimp to chimp, 100%. We're supposedly related to the human. Let's compare. Human to chimp, Y chromosome. 26.2%. Okay, let's check the X chromosome. Human to chimp, 97.6 apparently. Okay, human to human, 100%. Sure, there's similarities there. But the similarities we can say are due to common design. They can say due to common descent, but it's the differences that make all the difference. Human to chimp, Y chromosome, 26.2%. That right there is wild. Those are some extreme differences.
But you can see the descent of modification, let's say, within its own family, order, class, whatever word they want to call it, other than kind, or very similar variation. But there's got to be a point where no one says, a chimp can mate with a pineapple, right?
Right.
But there's got to be a point where, I don't know, the transitional fossils or whatever. But the point is, I know, Aaron Ra, whatever his name is, I know he wants to bring out his model, because there's still got to be a point where the pineapple is no longer a pineapple to get to the next step, right? How do they know what step that is from the amoeba to the humans? And how do you know that? How will they claim to have known that with descent with modification?
That's a good question. They call that, in a way, the law of monophyly, that we never outgrow our ancestry. Dogs will always be dogs. Humans will always be humans. Mammals will always be mammals, but we add traits. And so we can be taxonomically something different, but we never outgrow our ancestry. And so Aaron Ra, his challenge, if you've ever heard it, is called the phylogeny challenge. It basically challenges us to point to separate ancestry, show independent origins, show creatures that aren't related. But we just did that. We just did that right now. We showed, simply based on the Y chromosome, okay, this is our model that we put together.
There has to be independent forms of creation.
Exactly. This right here answers his so-called phylogeny challenge. Type into YouTube, phylogeny challenge, Aaron Ra. Oh, no creationist has answered that. We just answered it right here from one
through
piece
the
of
Y
data,
chromosome.
Y chromosome. So notice this. So here's our model. This is separate ancestry, okay? So here's humans, right? We start off as Adam. Adam and Eve have kids. Their kids have kids. Okay, but remember this. Adam and Eve are not created with mutations. Because you've probably heard this one. Anti-creationists will say, Adam and Eve, this would have been inbreeding. Inbreeding causes disease. No, inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. But wait a minute. Adam and Eve would have been created without mutations. Mutations enter the picture after the fall. That's when you start getting typographical errors. A mutation is just an alteration in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. You have 4 nucleotides, A, T, C, G. Okay, adenine, cytosine, guanine, A, T, C, G. And so, in terms of mutations, they don't come about until after the fall. But the evolutionary model, they explain the source for most or all genetic variation, Andy, as being the result of what? Mutations. You've probably heard it. Natural selection acting upon mutations, because mutations apparently add the necessary variation for selection to act upon.
Has that been demonstrated?
Well, no. So selection is a fine-tuning mechanism. What selection is basically is who's reproducing the most, who's having the most babies, who's passing on their genes. That's why they call it differential reproduction. That's all it means. Who's having the most kids, who's passing on their genes. So selection's great at fine-tuning a species, but that's all it can do. It doesn't add anything new. It doesn't add anything novel. But then that's where they say, well, mutations, that is the source for genetic novelty and genetic variation in material for selection to act upon and utilize. Unfortunately for the evolutionist, what they're now seeing, they've been seeing it for years, I got a whole presentation on it, that mutations, and I'd like to show you right from their own literature, are largely deleterious. Okay? They are, notice this, right from their own literature. In summary, the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. That means they're damaging, they're harmful, just like a typographical error in a text, Andy. If you have a book the size of an encyclopedia and you're copying out that book and you're always making a few mistakes every time, okay? Well, on their own, the book's so big, it's not really changing the message. But as those typographical errors build up over time, every time you copy
they become
the book,
consequential. Yeah.
Right. Then that's good. They go from inconsequential to consequential. When they're inconsequential, it's kind of like rust on your car. You get a brand new car, right? Right off the lot. Is there any rust on the car? If it's new, no, hopefully not. But over time,
bad designers.
5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the rust builds up, doesn't it? And you can take in your vehicle for random checks, get your new tires, get your oil changed, do your fixes, maintain your car, take care of it, right? Don't drive it like a maniac. But does that stop the eventual breakdown of the car, Andy? No, right?
No.
Like your car, no matter how good you are at taking care of it.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I didn't understand your question. Yes, eventually it will fall apart no matter how long.
Exactly. So that rust on your car, doesn't it kind of build up unnoticed for the most part? It's like, oh, here's a little rust spot. Here's another rust spot. It doesn't really change the way you drive or the overall
eventually everything will just stop working.
Right. Eventually the rust builds up to the point where, I need a new car. Better junk this one. And so that's how mutations work. The majority of mutations are nearly neutral. When you hear an evolutionist or anybody say, oh, the majority are neutral, they're actually wrong. The majority are nearly neutral. We have powerful evidence that the majority of the genome is functional. We have evidence for at least 80% of it being active. Okay, this is biochemical activity. We could do a whole show on that, so we'll just leave it at that. But the point is, that means the more mutations that accumulate, the more deleterious they're going to be because they're hitting functional regions of the genome. So the majority of them are, as you can see here in this citation, the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. And again, this is right from their own literature. Look what they admit, brother. This is one of the most well-established principles of evolutionary genetics. So the next time you see a militant evolutionist deny this, say your own side is admitting that this is one of the most well-established principles of evolutionary genetics, supported by both molecular and quantitative data. Now, here's the issue, though, for the evolutionists, okay? Andy, is that the majority of mutations are nearly neutral. Here's what that means. They're neutral to selection. So selection can't see them. They build up unchecked. Because of that, they spread through genetic drift. They spread throughout the population, these deleterious mutations. And what it results in is genetic sickness, genetic decline, and eventually genetic meltdown or genetic degeneration. So are mutations adding good beneficial variation for selection to act upon? No, it's largely adding deleterious variation.
Generation after generation.
Variation. Right.
Yeah.
It's like your car. You get a new car, you park, you go to the grocery store and you park it too close to another car. And someone swings open the door and you get a dent. Okay, there's some nice diversity for your car, right? You got a little dent on your car. Is that beneficial diversity though? It kind of sucks. You got a dent on your car now, right?
Of
The
course.
scratches, the dings, the dents. Sure, that's diversity. Mutations add diversity. Yeah, no doubt. Because they're adding something that was not previously there. Just like your new car now has a dent. But that's not good diversity. Okay? The majority of your beneficial diversity in the genome, Andy, is due to design. There's a fancy model, the model I hold to, it's called design diversity or created heterozygosity. That word's big, heterozygosity. It just means a state of DNA diversity. Okay, that Adam and Eve, right? God said, be fruitful and
Already had the
multiply.
diversity intact.
You got it. God front loaded pre existing DNA differences, millions of differences in chromosomes in Adam and Eve and the original created kinds. And
But
so Adam and Eve, go ahead.
If we've been multiplying or, procreating, wouldn't the deleterious then cause a major problem eventually for our own existence?
Absolutely.
Or, I mean, isn't there, like I said, low IQ over here. But wouldn't it eventually go back to a point where it can't go back anymore because eventually wouldn't the deleterious mean that there would have to be a time limit even on our own existence?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I like to say, take this point of most increasing genetic load because we've been accumulating. I mean, we're lucky you and I can sit here and talk and function
it's a miracle
at all.
Of creation. Yeah.
We're a copy off of a copy off of a copy off of a copy of Adam. A good way to understand it, take a piece of paper. Ken Hovind uses this illustration. It's really good.
And the copying of the DVDs.
Yes.
Keep copying the copy and copying the copy. Yeah, of course. As always.
Is it ever going to get lost? Right? Is it ever going to get better? No, you just keep copying it over and over again.
But they will always say, yeah, but that's non-biological processes. Yeah. So they'll be like, yeah, that's a computer. That's a false equivalence.
Yeah, that's what they'll say.
It's a good analogy, but they're going to always say it's a false equivalence because you're dealing with
because they like to say, oh, cars don't reproduce, computers don't reproduce. Yeah. But then you'll see them, they'll use
analogy. But non-life can come to life though, right, Donny?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, here's the thing.
The fallacy of convenience, man.
It's barely an inconvenience for them. And I like to say, okay, adding reproduction doesn't help you. It adds more complexity. It adds more sophistication. So it doesn't make evolution easier. It makes it more unlikely. Plus, it misunderstands the model. Well, what did I say earlier? The book of Genesis says that God created two people, Adam and Eve. Okay. Mm-hmm. It also says that we are made as human beings. We are made in the image of God. Okay. What does that mean, brother? That means there must be something about us that reflects the divine. Okay. People debate, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Well, again, there's at least something about us that reflects the divine. Okay. And so I'm just trying to find my slides here on this, but right here. So, okay.
We'll go 10 minutes. I don't want to keep you here all day, man, but I can listen to you all day. I really could. I just don't want to keep you all day, but I love it. I'm loving this.
We'll go through a few more things. No, I have a blast talking about this. So however long.
I can tell you're a superstar, man.
I appreciate it. This has been great so far. So to leave no stone unturned for when we upload this to your channel and mine, I know what the evolutionists will say. Let's demolish them right here. So we know there's something about us that reflects the divine. God created what? Two people. Okay, so I got a whole presentation here going over the biblical data, right? The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. Eve was made from his side. We know there's going to be scoffers in the last days, of course. We're seeing that. And it's interesting too. If there was no first Adam, then what was the necessity of the last Adam? Here's Jesus. From the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. Okay, so the Bible says God created two people, Adam, the first man, Eve, the mother of all living. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. To recap a couple things, Andy, what did we talk about earlier? Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome have literally discovered our first parents, the first couple, Adam and Eve. Okay, so we don't need to be a theistic evolutionist and a progressive creationist, although a lot of them do believe at least in the special creation of Adam and Eve, or these ancient Near Eastern scholars. No, we don't need to twist what the Bible says, because science has actually confirmed what the Bible says about human origins. Okay, so here's my model. Here's the model that I would argue. God creates man in his own image. There's something about us that reflects the divine. That means perhaps we can get an idea or a sense for how God created the biological world based on the way we design things. Okay, so tell me if this makes sense. So we design in homologous patterns, right? Human engineers, we talked about this. We also design in nested hierarchical patterns, where sedans are a lot more similar to an SUV than they are to a boat or an airplane or a skateboard. Natural nested hierarchical patterns. And this is what we find in the biological world. We didn't have to find this. This could have been totally opposite. Maybe we didn't find these kinds of patterns, right? And it would be more complicated for us to address. Well, when the evolutionist says, oh, cars don't reproduce, it's a complete misunderstanding of what we're saying. We are saying, hey, maybe we can get a sense for how God designed based on the way we design, and there is a perfect match or analogy there. Okay? And you know what? I shouldn't use the word perfect, because God is so above and beyond our capabilities. We're oftentimes just catching up to what God has already thought of in the past. Okay? All these backup mechanisms that we've discovered now in our genomes. And so God creates Adam and Eve with pre-existing DNA diversity. There's no inbreeding problem. Adam and Eve have kids. Their kids have kids. There's no mutations to come to the forefront to lead to disease. A couple thousand years later, you have the flood. Right, brother? You have the flood bottleneck. The earth restarts with 3 reproducing couples, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their 3 wives. Remember we talked about mitochondrial DNA passed down on the mother's side? Yeah. Well, what did I just say? The earth is overspread by 3 couples. Shem, Ham, Japheth, their 3 wives. What do we find, brother? Have a look at this visual. This is fascinating. This is confusing when you first look at it. I get it. But this is what's called a phylogenetic tree of human DNA, specifically mitochondrial DNA from women. These lines here, they just represent mutations or DNA differences. But the most important point that I want you and your audience to look at here and consider is we have what's called haplogroups, okay? And you have 3 major haplogroups right in the center of this tree. You have your 3 arrows. These are called, in technical terms, L, M, and N. Well, wait a minute. All mitochondrial DNA goes back to 3 major groups, 3 major nodes. What does the Bible say, brother? The earth was overspread by 3 reproducing couples after the flood. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their what? Their 3 wives, Noah's 3 daughters-in-law. And yet all mitochondrial DNA can be traced back to 3 groups? Is that not amazing confirmation of exactly what the Bible says occurred after the flood? 3 women.
No, it's just
3
coincidence.
major groups. What are your thoughts on that, brother?
I know, it's just saying, it's purely coincidence.
Yeah, just pure. It's not just a coincidence. The Bible's not true. The Bible's false, right? We're related to strawberries.
Yeah. So, but the middle green arrow is going in like either direction. Is that obviously because you got the male and the female side?
That's a great question. So this specifically, this
is a stupid question because I'm not very smart.
No, it's a great. These are all great questions, especially because, and it's great you as host. You're an excellent host because you're asking these kinds of questions, because these are the kinds of questions that those in the audience might have. So why not clarify? Why not be detailed, right?
You're the best up and coming creationist, hands down. But I think most people are going to lose you with all of this terminology, my friend. So I'm just trying to bring it back to my level, because I'm pretty sure then everyone will be safe. So, and I don't want to take up too much time. Otherwise, I would ask even more questions. But like, is it because it's going on either side? Is that the 2 different?
It's a great question. So the answer would be this. This is mitochondrial DNA. So that's maternally inherited. So this is passed down on the mother's side.
Yep. Yeah.
So we have a similar tree, a Y chromosome tree that shows one man, Noah. But for this
Yeah.
one, I'll explain exactly what this means. So you have
Okay.
these three nodes, and you're
Mm-hmm.
asking about why from these three nodes you have the lines basically spreading out in different
Yeah.
directions. Yeah, okay. So these lines, they represent DNA differences or mutations in people, okay,
Mm-hmm.
on the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so what this would represent from the biblical model is if these three nodes really are Noah's three daughters-in-law,
Oh,
Andy,
right. You're pointing to the point at which it breaks out. Sorry,
right,
I'm
three
seeing it now.
roots.
Sorry. Bad
No,
question.
you're good. You're good.
No, I just can't make. So you're pointing to the single point at which it branches out, the
Yes,
diversity,
the origin points. So
the
these are
origin points. Yeah.
yes. So these
Okay,
are
I
the
get you
three
now.
roots. So let's
Yeah.
hypothesize. That's what science is all about. Let's say these really are Noah's three daughters-in-law.
Yeah.
Okay. So what would we expect? Well, in the pre-flood world, we had less time and probably less mutations, right? Because the pre-flood world was a lot more pristine. There was
Mm-hmm.
a lot less harmful effects in your pre-flood world rather than the post-flood world, where the real estate was rearranged, the environment was changed drastically, lots of negative side effects, unfortunately, from the flood. Okay. So these lines connecting each other, let's say they're Noah's three daughters-in-law, these
Mm-hmm.
lines therefore would represent the pre-flood world. Okay. So if these represent the pre-flood world, that actually fits because the lines are smaller. Think about it. If the lines represent mutations and fewer generations passed in the pre-flood world, we would actually expect these nodes connecting each other that the lines would be shorter. But the post-flood world, we'd expect many more mutations accumulating, and there's been more time, more generations. It's been about 4,500 years since the flood. So we would expect that the lines radiating out from these three nodes, we'd expect them to be longer. And what do we find? They're longer. The lines connecting the nodes short, the lines radiating out from all
What would
directions.
they? Sorry, Donnie. What would you expect them to be longer from a creationist perspective?
We would expect them to be longer because since the flood, more time has passed. So we got 4,500 years,
And there's
rather
more.
than from creation to the flood was about 2,000 years.
Yeah.
But we'd also expect in the pre-flood world fewer mutations passed on because the genomes were more pristine. They
Mm-hmm.
would have been more superior in many
Okay.
ways. The environments would have been a lot better and suitable for human beings pre-flood than post-flood. So we'd
Yeah.
expect a lot more defects and degeneration after the flood. Does that make sense, brother?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's those are a few reasons why we'd expect the lines radiating out from these nodes to be longer, because this is representing post-flood history, and
Mm.
post-flood history but there'd be more history in 4,500 years, more mutations, more
That's
defects.
because there's a lot more happening in a less amount of time.
Yeah, there'd be a lot more happening actually in more amount of time. Because if you think about it, from creation to the flood is how long? 2,000 years, right?
Creation to the flood. Yep.
And then from the flood to now is about 4,500 years.
Yep.
So more time, more generations, more mutations, and therefore longer lines, more
So
branches.
you're saying that roughly it's 6,500 years, but that's a different. Well, yeah.
Well, yeah, I'd probably say more like 6,200 years. So I say
Yeah.
4,500. It's probably more like 42. I think the Earth is about 62 to
Yeah. Right.
6,300 years, I think.
Yep.
So yeah, but the major point is these fit, and you could actually do the same thing with. And I'm comprehensive. I like to be. I've got refuting objections. Oh, what would the critics say to this? What would the evolutionists say? Well, I know what they'd say, and I know how to refute them. But that's probably not necessary right now. But we could do the same thing for Y chromosome. But what I really wanted to do for your audience, as I know time is getting away from us, as
We
time
can do
does
this.
fly
We'll
by.
do this again, Donnie. Don't worry. We can do this
Yeah,
again.
we could do a whole
could do this
series,
all.
brother.
I could do this. If I wasn't working, buddy, I would be doing this all day with you.
We could do a whole 12-part series, and just blow the minds of
Just keep going
your audience.
each level, yeah. So starting with time, space, matter, all the way
And
through.
and I like that you threw a couple curveballs at the beginning with the distant starlight, because it was a good way to set the foundation for touching on a number of topics. We've managed to go from astronomy to biology to genetics. And so I want to leave your audience with this, and this will get them excited for where we can do a part 2. And so I've got presentations, brother, on just about all these. Okay, these are lines of evidence for a young Earth. Helium diffusion.
This would be fantastic to go through. Give each their own time, because they're all fantastic.
Exactly. Yeah, they really are. And I've given you a couple teasers of magnetic field, for example. We talked a little bit about that. We talked about the James Webb Space Telescope. On the distant starlight, I do recommend people check on my channel. Type in distant starlight, Jason Lyle, and they'll get a full breakdown of what he's saying on how we can see light from even the most distant regions of the universe in real time. It's arriving instantaneously, basically, in that direction. Okay. And so I just wanted to focus on one here, and then we'll wrap it up, and hopefully we can do a second part, because I'd love to give you guys a whole presentation on carbon-14.
You just let me know when you're ready, Donny.
Okay. So right now I want to go over helium and zircon crystals. And I will say, from this slide, genetic degeneration, we did talk a little bit about that, so that's good. Original organic material in dinosaur fossils, that's another one that the evolutionary community simply can't explain. I mean, how are these original bio materials, okay, how are they intact if dinosaur fossils really are millions of years old? I mean, they're finding in basically every single layer, they're finding collagen, red blood cells, proteins, DNA. They're finding DNA in Neanderthals that are supposed to have
What would you
gone.
say, on a layman level, out of these? I would say dinosaurs would be the one where you hear the most from it, because I've got a whole family full of skeptics. So the one area that I think trumps or tricks people over with a young Earth is because of the dinosaurs. So I would love to do in the next session on just dinosaurs, something that I can just
and that's one of my favorite. We did a conference recently with Institute for Creation Research and a couple other ministries, Genesis Apologetics and the Grand Experiment. Dr. Brian Thomas, he's a scientist for ICR. He published recently, I think it's Analytical Biology. There's over 120 papers now in the conventional literature going over these biomolecules found in many fossils. It does not coincide well at all with the conventional ages of dinosaurs and the geologic record in general. And because these biomolecules, they would have degraded. Collagen would have degraded. DNA would have degraded. We should not be finding intact collagen and proteins and soft tissue in these fossils. So that tells us that these dinosaurs are young. They went extinct just thousands of years ago, not millions of years ago.
We've got stories. We've got stories of attacking Beowulf and look, China. There's little pictures of dragons everywhere. I mean,
that's right. We've got depictions of dinosaurs in just about every single civilization. We've got stories from Alexander the Great, Herodotus. We've got stories.
That would be a very fascinating episode.
We could go over the pictures. Even in the Bible, Job 40 and 41, behemoth, tail like a cedar tree.
Tail like a cedar tree. That's not an elephant.
No, not an elephant. Because that little wet noodle, that is not an elephant or a hippo or a bull. Some are trying to say that it's a bull too.
And have the full strength in the loins. I mean, that's just...
it's amazing. We've done many shows on behemoth that your audience can check out. But yeah, we can do a whole one on dinosaurs.
Sure.
This one...
Sorry.
Oh, no, you're doing great. I want to wrap up with this one, and then we can focus on the other ones in another show. Because this here, it's technical. I'm going to break it down, though, in a few minutes, over the course of a few minutes. This is an irrefutable line of evidence. This is one of those lines of evidence that's not agnostic. It's discriminatory data that precludes an old Earth. Okay. And so helium in zircon crystals. What are we talking about here? Well, when it comes to these decay processes, Andy, we have uranium, right? Uranium to lead, potassium to argon, for example. When it comes to this, these helium and zircon crystals, we have uranium turning to lead. Okay. And during this process of uranium becoming lead through radioactive decay, you have helium, which is a gas. It's a slippery gas, slippery molecule. Helium is produced a certain amount throughout the nuclear decay that's occurring in the zircon. And helium can actually move through rocks since rocks are porous. And that means gas can escape through the rocks. Okay. So if we're on the same page, helium is produced, but it also escapes into the atmosphere as it's being produced. Okay. Now, here's the thing. We do find evidence in these
helium is produced in zircon, decayed zircon.
That's right. Yeah. As your uranium is decaying into lead, as that process is taking place, you're having helium as a byproduct also being produced.
Sure. Okay.
But the helium, it's a slippery molecule and it releases into the atmosphere over time. Okay. And so we find rocks that have evidence for uranium, lead, and an abundance of helium as a byproduct. So since we're taking this slowly, that means uranium has been decaying into lead because we find uranium and lead, and we're finding a lot of helium. So that's evidence that radioactive decay is happening. Uranium has been decaying into lead, and uranium is the result. It's a byproduct.
And now, the decaying is like an unstable atoms, yeah? Is that how decay is measured?
Yes, because you have parent isotopes and daughter isotopes. So you have stable isotopes and unstable. And so that's why you have uranium slowly decaying in that instance into lead. You could have potassium decaying into argon, right? There's different types of decay methods. And so in this instance, you have, through this process, you have helium that is being created, but also leaking out. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. This is truly one of the best lines of evidence for a young Earth. Okay, so you have helium that's being released, but the evolutionist camp, they're saying that this process of decay, uranium to lead, is taking millions to billions of years. As a matter of fact, these zircon crystals here, okay, here's the image that we made through AI. So cool. You've got the zircon crystal with the helium leaving, right, over time. And so they'll say that, okay, this is happening over hundreds of millions of years. Well, what does this mean? We understand the rate as to which helium will leave into the atmosphere, dissipate. Okay, that means over hundreds of millions of years, we'd have plenty of time for all that helium to leak through the rock.
You can measure the amount of helium in the atmosphere.
Right, yep. You compare with the atmosphere, look at the rocks, how much uranium to lead decay has taken place.
In terms of the age of the Earth perspective, sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no, that's good.
So could you tell, you can measure the amount of helium based upon the age of the Earth and calculate there would be more helium? Is that where you're going?
Well, they're going to say that because of the amount of uranium and lead that we have, when they date those rocks through uranium to lead decay, those rocks must be billions of years old because of the amount of lead that's there. So there must have been this amount of uranium to lead. But is that really the case? Well, helium moves through these rocks quickly. Again, it's a slippery molecule. And so over millions of years, if these rocks really were millions to billions of years, Andy, that means all of that helium would have more than enough time to leak and escape into the atmosphere. But we actually find an abundance of helium in all of these rocks, in these zircon crystals. But if this process was taking place over billions of years, then
there would be less.
There'd be less. Exactly. We should not find the amount of helium that we actually do find because we can measure this process as to how quickly helium can move through
He's
these
been
rocks and
evaporated.
escape into the exactly and be evaporated. And so we find an
Cool.
abundance of helium. Where if these rocks really were billions of years, no, you should have very little helium because it's still decaying. So you're going to expect a little bit of helium, but not the overwhelming amount that we do find. Dr. Russell Humphreys, here's a paper. It's a technical paper. There was a team called the RATE team, the RATE project, radioisotopes in the age of the Earth. Several young Earth creation scientists went into this project to test the validity of dating methods. They made predictions. And this was one of the pieces of evidence that they discovered, that helium diffusion rates support accelerated decay. Now, why it says accelerated decay, I'll explain in a second, but I want to go through this citation. This is Dr. Russell Humphreys himself explaining it. And so notice this. Uranium and thorium generate helium atoms as they decay to lead. A study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research showed that such helium produced in zircon crystals in deep, hot Precambrian, so that is like just hundreds of millions of years old. You got Precambrian, Cambrian, and then up to where we'd be today. So they say that's just a long time ago. Hot Precambrian granitic rock has not had time to escape. Though the rocks contain, this is an important point, though the rocks contain 1.5 billion years worth of nuclear decay products, right, the uranium to lead, newly measured rates of helium loss from zircon show that the helium has been leaking for only 6,000 years. Brother,
Awesome.
this
That's
is
what I was
a
getting at with my first
scientific data point.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But that was what I was trying to very poorly get, like that was going to be your conclusion. That is basically, measuring the helium loss, and based on the loss you can measure how old that was what I was trying to.
Yes, right.
Sorry, you misunderstood me because I'm not very smart.
No need to be sorry. You nailed it.
That's kind of where I was going with that. Yeah.
Well, you were going in a direction that is accurate, because the rapid rate of helium diffusion suggests that the Earth, based on leakage rates, can only be 6,000 years, plus or minus a couple thousand. Okay, 6,000 to 10,000 years. But there's two pieces of evidence here. Okay, so I'm going to explain this the best way that I can.
Millions, that's the point.
Right, it's not billions, that's for sure. And it's a major point because you'll find a lot of theistic evolutionists and old Earth creationists. They'll say, oh, you guys love to point to supernova remnants or the decaying magnetic field or C14. C14 decays so rapidly, Andy, that we should not find C14 in samples that are supposed to be millions of billions of years old, like
Absolutely
diamonds or coal. But yet we find C14 basically anywhere you look in the
should have been decayed.
Decay shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be C14 in diamonds. Shouldn't be C14 in coal. The half-life is way too short.
Isn't the half-life of a C14 about, is it 4,500 years?
5,600 years.
56, sorry.
Yeah. So
it's been a while since I watched the seminar.
No, you're close. And if every single atom in the universe were made of C14, there should be no C14 left in 500,000 years. Yet we find C14 in just about everything that's tested. We point to these lines of evidence: the recession of the moon, the fact that the moon's moving further from us over time, that limits the age of the universe. And they'll say, okay, well, that just limits the age of the universe, but it doesn't actually give you 6,000 years, is what they'll say. I want to see a scientific evidence that gives us 6,000 years. They'll challenge us. Well, here's one. This is helium diffusion and measuring the rates of helium loss from zircons. Andy, what does this say in this paper? It's only been leaking for 6,000 years. So the next time somebody says, show me a piece of evidence that gives me 6,000, here it is. 6,000 years based on a scientific piece of mutation rates do the same. That'll also give them what they want. And so this is a piece of scientific evidence. This is an observation that offers 6,000, and they have no good explanation for this. But
you perfectly hit the brief, Donny. This is all the new stuff that I've got no idea about, right? So, and I think the audience has have no idea about. So this is hitting the brief, brother. So I really do appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. there's a lot of creationists out there. There's a lot of creation ministries. And I spend a lot of time, I have over the years. I've personally done 100 formal debates myself, and I've moderated well over 400.
Yeah.
And I spent the years debating probably your most militant evolutionists out there on YouTube, especially. And so they like to use a lot of technical arguments. And so what I've done is countered them largely through technical arguments, fighting fire with fire. And that does require a lot of study and research. Thank God I do this full time. My main area of study is genetics and biology, but I do what I can on these various subjects as well. So I like to latch onto your pieces of scientific evidence, Andy, like this, right? Helium diffusion, helium and zircon crystals that I know they have not even a good rescue device for. Not even a good maybe this or maybe that. No, they literally have.
Could they say obviously they would have said it. Could they say that it's only showing 6,000 years? We don't understand why it started diffusing at that point in time.
Well, they could say we don't know because of XYZ, but it's not really science. That's
no, it's not science,
right
but it's
to
like
believe.
Yeah, because you can't say that like zircon came into existence just like 10,000 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, exactly. They're gonna have because we not only believe
everything came from the Big Bang or that big explosion.
Exactly. I mean, as humans, we're just recycled stardust, right? All the matter and energy and material in the world was basically squeezed into a dot smaller than a single period on a piece of paper. So everything to them has evolved. Nothing's really been created. But to us at creation, there were created trees, created rocks, humans were created, animals were created. So we have no problem saying, hey, diamonds were created, zircon crystals were created, granitic rock was good. There's all kinds. Trees were created. Okay. And so, they can't obviously admit to that. But why this is also important, because if you notice in this citation here, we do have evidence that decay has occurred, uranium to lead, because there is lead. Okay. So this is interesting. Think about this, Andy. We have uranium, lead, and a lot of helium. So it almost looks like we have evidence for an old Earth and a young Earth in zircon crystals, because we have uranium to lead. This nuclear decay has happened, but yet we have a lot of helium. So what the rate scientists concluded, at least, and I think it's a pretty good conclusion. There are other ways you can look at this, but one easy way to look at it is during the flood year, right? The flood catastrophic processes would have released a lot of heat, energy, and radiation, but heat and energy. And during that flood year, many in the creationist world, they've suggested that there was an accelerated decay. So radioisotope decay was accelerated, but it was only accelerated for a short period of time, which is why you find uranium and lead. Okay, but because we find the abundance of helium in the zircon crystals, that suggests that, okay, you had a lot of decay quickly, and it had to be quickly, or else that helium would have escaped into the atmosphere. So does that make sense? We have a lot of helium, but also a lot of decay, which suggests that there was a lot of decay, but that decay happened rapidly during the flood year. Does that make sense, brother? And so if you've ever heard accelerated nuclear decay before,
no,
that's okay. Well, right there would be that would be, because here's the thing. The next question is, the evolutionists will say, well, why do lower rocks in, say, the Precambrian, why do they date older than higher rocks? Okay, why are there these patterns? Well, if accelerated nuclear decay is true, and you have rocks being laid down during that flood year, but these rocks are being subject to different degrees of accelerated nuclear decay based on this and many other pieces of evidence, well, that means rocks that are laid down earlier in the flood, they're going to experience more hits or rounds of accelerated decay than rocks laid down later in the flood year.
Why?
So yeah, those earlier rocks will date older than rocks that are formed later because they were hit with more rounds of accelerated decay. So sure, we could have relative ages. You can say those are billions of years old. That's just relative, though. That's not absolute. So that would be that would be your technical follow-up to an informed evolutionist that says, okay, fine, helium and zircon crystals, or C14 in coal diamonds and dinosaur fossils. But why do the lower layers date billions of years and your higher layers, they date less? Well, there's a reason. Accelerated decay during the flood year. And so, there's no evidence for accelerated decay. Well, firstly, in the lab, they have sped up nuclear decay rates. And secondly, here's a piece of evidence.
So
How
why
is there
wouldn't
so
it?
much helium in these zircon crystals if these zircon crystals really go back billions of years? They have no good answer. Andy, go ahead, brother.
Why would there be? Why would the age? Why would the accelerated decay rate be faster in rocks? The
Well,
first layer.
well, so
I mean, maybe. Sorry, I shouldn't keep asking questions. I should just shut up.
no, you ask whatever you need. These are great questions. I did a whole series with a flood researcher called Flood Boundaries, Michael J. Ord. So this goes into a whole nother technical topic
Okay.
of where the flood boundaries, because obviously you have created rock, right?
Mm,
And then you have the flood. So you have new rock being created plus the
sure.
shuffling of pre-existing rock. But then
Yeah.
you also have rock produced, sedimentary rock layers produced, and geological features created after the flood. Right? Because after the flood, you have a post-flood ice age that lasts 500 to maybe 800 years. You have local catastrophes happening after the flood. So you actually have pre-flood boundaries, flood boundaries, and post-flood boundaries. But in terms of the flood layers, you'd expect rocks that are formed early in the flood versus later in the flood. You'd expect those ones laid down earlier in the flood to date older because they experienced more accelerated decay than rocks laid down later in the flood. They would experience accelerated decay, but less of it because less period of time, right? Does that make sense?
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's better. Yeah.
And
We can
so
touch on that next.
that would explain your patterns. But they have tested newly formed rocks, okay? Because you have igneous rock, right? Formed through volcanic eruptions. They've tested these rocks. We know when they were formed, right? A short amount of time ago within our lifetime.
They've dated way back.
Yeah, they're dated. They're dated at hundreds of thousands to millions to billions of years. And it's like, well, wait a
In
minute.
any other discipline, that would immediately be discredited.
Be
If you're
thrown
talking
out.
about it, it'd be thrown out. Like if you talk about law, that type of level of discrepancy would be thrown out. Totally. But they can't because the consequences is completely different. So,
Well, and
or
that's the thing.
it leads to a conclusion they don't want.
Well, and that's the thing is the evolutionary community, they believe in science until supposedly they believe in science until you show them these kinds of observations. Now they no longer believe in it. And I like to ask this question, Andy. Okay. Why should I trust the dates that you give us from rocks of unknown age? Oh, this rock here is 500 million years old. This rock here is 2 billion years old. Wait a minute. You can't even give me accurate dates for rocks of known age. So therefore, why should I trust the dates that you're giving me from rocks of unknown age? Clearly, these dating methods don't work.
I mean, it's just the psychological manipulation. I mean, you go to who was that guy that debated Ken Ham, the one that
Bill Nye, the science guy.
Yeah, Bill, that guy. When he said, you should believe, like his whole opening presentation was, in summary, you should believe in the science guys because iPhone. And I'm thinking, I'm trying to work out. I know I've got low IQ, but I'm trying to work out. His whole presentation was evolution is true because iPhone.
Right.
I mean, that's what I got from it, right? And I'm thinking, okay, what does that have to do with the prosperity?
Our phones, the cars that we drive, the technology that we're using for
no one denies the science in the iPhone, brother. Like it's a false equivalence. Why are you bringing that up?
This is all empirical science. This is stuff, right? Science is
you can measure and observe.
Exactly, observable, repeatable, testable evidence. And it's actually the creationists that are doing this. We're the ones making the testable predictions. The rate project that I was telling you about, where these scientists went in to test and see if these dating methods are valid or not, they went in and made several predictions. And this is where they discovered things like helium and zircon crystals, Dr. Russell Humphreys, he's made several predictions on the magnetic fields of other planets we can get into in another show, and those came out to be true. Dr. Jason Lau made predictions before we got the James Webb Space Telescope data. He made predictions on what those galaxies in the distant universe should look like if creation is true, and that's what the galaxies came out to look like. I mean, this is real science. We predict function in the genome. We predict treasure in the genome. The evolutionary community predicts viral fossils, junk DNA, evolutionary leftovers. What do we find, Andy? Function after function. So it's creationists
But
that are
Donny,
doing science.
But Donny, from a digital marketer perspective, you lost the cultural war though, because this ain't getting out,
Right.
right?
We got to get
Like
it out.
you got to get it out, and you got to break it down into like my terms,
Yeah.
generally,
I
right?
think that's why you're an effective host too, because we can go over these technical topics and you can say, hey, Donnie, wait a minute. Before you continue, what do you mean by this? What did you mean by that? Can you
That's why
define
Ken
this?
Hovind was so effective, yeah,
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
that break,
He's
because of
one of
that,
the,
because of
he's
that.
one of the best at taking the technical stuff and breaking it down to where a layperson can understand.
But you're an upcoming superstar, and may God bless you richly. You keep going.
Well, I appreciate
But I
this,
think,
brother. This has been a ton of fun.
but you gotta break it down a bit more because, dude, like yeah, because like, and if you're in that context of like with those super smart people, that's perfectly why you kind of align that way. But you're obviously a very smart guy. You know your stuff, and that even I got when you explained the helium and the zircon, I got that part very
Yeah.
well. So that was
And
excellent
do you see how
presented.
something like that, if someone were to just say, well, if someone were to go over that argument real quickly, helium and zircon crystals, we find helium, we shouldn't find it. There's an evidence for a young Earth. You'd
There's
be
too much.
thinking, you'd be thinking how, why, where. You wouldn't understand it. So that's why it's almost best to take, okay, here's one technical point, helium and zircon crystals. Now let's discuss it for 20 minutes. Let's make sure that you and the audience understand it. And then, okay, now that we got that, let's go to another one. So rather than rushing through the really technical arguments, we take our time with them. And just as you said, Andy, my brother, now it makes sense to you. And now you can see, and hopefully the audience, why this is just one of the many pieces of evidence that completely destroy an old Earth.
And yeah, man. And we just got to get it out. They're going to spread it out more. And I mean, like it was good when they gave. Like, is there many debates going on like there was back like in the Kent days, like of the early what was it, probably early 2000s,
Yeah.
where they sort of create. And they said that the only time this argument is the only place this argument is in America and New Zealand. That's not true because I mean Ken Ham's Australian. It was he just couldn't get the opportunity. I don't think that's why he probably fled to America. But they ain't going just. I mean, is there opportunities for you, Donnie, to kind of like get more in the Berkeley? I mean, you're from Canada, but like,
Yeah.
is there more opportunity for you to kind of present to unis and get that to professors and get your work sort of scrutinized in front of like
Right.
a hostile like Berkeley, like Kent was in Berkeley?
I think that's the benefits and upside of the day and age we live in, where we
Yeah,
have such incredible technology, where we
yeah,
can utilize, I can do a talk. So whereas back in the day in the early 2000s, to do a presentation or to reach a lot of people or do a debate,
you
you'd have
have to do
to,
a lot of
right,
huge.
you have to set up a venue. You couldn't really do it on, that's why you got to find those in videotapes oftentimes. Whereas today I can do a presentation or a talk or host a debate right online where people are comfortable in their own houses and still
Yeah,
reach thousands of people.
of course, man. We don't need John Ankerberg, right?
Yeah.
But but yeah, but you want like, yeah, the fact that you did the debates too, man, because debating is and that open discussions where you can go back and forth with ideas. Me personally, that I kind of get most from any debate when it's just like quick, like two people are just arguing back and forth, and so I'm like, so they're challenging on their quote unquote weaker points to try to take advantage of the weaker points. That's where I'm kind of learning a lot in that
Yeah.
more on the adversary, when it's a bit more
It really helped
opponent on opponent.
for me.
That's how
When I first started my channel, it was strictly me debating. I jumped in, I was working a secular job at the time. I never thought I would do this full time. And I saw a lot of the debates that were taking place on your atheist debate channels back then. And I said to myself, we need more creationists in the debate ring. And so I learned how to make myself an account. And I must have spent the next year just doing nothing but debates. I was jumping into all the atheist rooms. There were times where it'd be me versus like 7 atheists. So I did that for about a year. And, the atheist community noticed me. And then I ended up thinking, you know what, I'm going to start my own debate platform and make sure that these debates are fair and professional and
You do a
moderated in
great
a
job.
neutral manner. And so it's been a journey. It's been fun. But I really like the fact, I don't regret it at all, that I started off jumping into the deep end, because what it allowed me to see, Andy, is all their best arguments. Because I
Mm-hmm.
jumped into basically, these debate rooms with the best of the best in terms of the evolutionary community. And so right from the beginning, I saw what all their best arguments are. And I was really able to devote a lot of time to studying those and refuting those, because I saw what they were. I was literally debating them. So I feel like that's been helpful.
Excellent. Donny, thank you so much. You can get Donny if you love this material, guys, or you want to learn more about it, Standing for Truth Ministries on YouTube. I'll put all the links in the description. Donny, would you like a final word?
Andy, this has been great. I appreciate the time and the platform that you've given me. I know how busy you are. So, firstly, thanks for inviting me on. And thank you for giving me a couple hours to provide just a few of the many reasons, brother, why it truly is an amazing time to be a biblical creationist. So, I really enjoyed this.
Amen. Let's leave it on that. Thanks so much, Donny.
Thank you. God bless.